Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Nobody prepares you for how ordinary everything feels right before your world shifts. February morning, downtown Cleveland, and I'm sorting through campaign metrics while the coffee maker gurgles its usual complaint. Marketing assistant, 4 months into the job after finishing my degree at 31. Finally getting my life together after years of bartending and bad decisions. Our office sits on the 7th floor of one of those interconnected downtown complexes where 3 buildings share a parking garage, and you can walk between them without ever going outside. Glass windows floor to ceiling on the east wall. Perfect view of the Huntington building across the plaza. I remember thinking how the frost patterns on the windows looked like tiny cities, spreading across the glass while steam from my mug fogged up a small circle where I leaned against the window. Everything changed when the first patrol car screamed into the plaza below. Then another, then 6 more, all at different angles, officers jumping out with their weapons drawn and pointing at the Huntington building entrance. Diane from accounting pressed against the window next to me, her breath coming quick and shallow, leaving larger fog circles on the glass. We watched a SWAT van pull up, officers in full tactical gear pouring out like ants from a kicked hill. Someone behind us dropped their phone, and the crack against the tile floor made everyone jump. Through the frost and fog on the window, we could see people streaming out of Huntington's side exits, some running, some walking backward with their hands up, all of them being directed behind the police line by officers gesturing frantically. Our floor manager, Kevin, burst through the stairwell door, face flushed and tie crooked. "Active shooter in Huntington," he said, voice cracking on the word shooter. "Locked down, everybody away from the windows into the conference rooms now." But we stood there for another few seconds, mesmerized, watching the chaos below like it was happening on a screen instead of 70 feet away. A woman in a red coat stumbled out of Huntington's main entrance and collapsed on the sidewalk, 2 officers rushing to drag her behind a police car. That made it real. That made 27 of us scramble away from the windows, knocking over coffee cups and scattering papers, cramming ourselves into the 3 conference rooms on the west side of our floor. The smell of spilled coffee mixed with sudden sweat and fear. Conference room C became our world. 15 of us packed into a space meant for 8, sitting on the floor with our backs against the walls, knees drawn up, trying to make ourselves small. Nathan from IT had his police scanner app running on his phone, volume barely audible, crackling with codes and street names I recognized. "Suspect last seen heading toward underground parking level," the dispatcher said. Multiple buildings connected via lower level. The fluorescent lights hummed above us, that specific frequency that usually annoyed me during long meetings but now seemed like the only normal thing left. Diane sat next to me, her fingers wrapped around her ankle so tight I could see the white crescents of her knuckles. She kept whispering about her daughter at daycare, how she was supposed to pick her up at noon, how the daycare would call her ex-husband if she didn't show up. The scanner crackled again. Suspect entered Building 3 through maintenance access. Building 3. Our building. Nathan's hand trembled as he fumbled to mute the app, but we'd all heard it. The air in the conference room became thick, like breathing through wet cloth. Kevin stood up, pressing his ear against the door, then quickly sat back down when footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Not running footsteps, just regular walking, which somehow made it worse. The footsteps paused right outside our door. I could hear breathing, or maybe it was my own breath bouncing off the wall behind me. The door handle rattled, just a small movement, like someone testing if it was locked. Diane grabbed my wrist, her fingernails digging crescents into my skin. The handle rattled again, harder this time, and then the footsteps continued down the hall. We stayed frozen for what must have been 5 minutes but felt like hours before we heard it. A door slamming open somewhere down the hall, followed by shouting. Not police shouting, not commanding voices, but panic. High-pitched screaming from what sounded like the accounting department. maybe 40 feet from our conference room. Then a loud pop, another pop. The screaming stopped, replaced by a different kind of sound, muffled sobbing and whimpering. Heavy footsteps again, slower now, methodical. They stopped at each door, testing handles, getting closer. Someone in our room, I think it was Brandon from sales, started hyperventilating. Nathan clamped his hand over Brandon's mouth, both of them shaking. The footsteps reached the conference room next to ours, room B. The handle turned. That door wasn't locked. We heard chairs scraping, people scrambling, a woman's voice saying, "Please, please, please," and then 3 quick pops. Something heavy hit the shared wall between the conference rooms, sliding down with a sound that made my teeth ache. Our door handle turned. The lock held, but the door shuddered as something slammed against it. Again. Again. Each impact made the cheap wood flex inward. Kevin crawled toward the door on his stomach, reaching up to brace his hand against it, trying to hold it shut. Another slam. The wood around the lock started to splinter. I could see a crack forming, spreading like lightning through the white paint. Diane had her phone out, texting something, her thumb moving in quick jerks. "Love you, baby girl," I saw on her screen before she hit send. The slamming stopped. We could hear breathing on the other side of the door, ragged and heavy. Then footsteps again, but running this time, getting distant. Shouting from far away, professional voices this time, police commands echoing through the hallway. More running, organized and tactical, boot falls in formation. 20 minutes passed before the police knocked on our door, identifying themselves, telling us to open slowly with our hands visible. They moved us out in a line, hands on our heads. Through hallways I walked every day but didn't recognize anymore. The accounting department door hung off its hinges. Dark stains on the gray carpet that my brain refused to process. In conference room B, paramedics worked on people I knew, had eaten lunch with, had complained about the broken printer with. They wouldn't let us look, kept us moving. But I saw Melissa's yellow cardigan on the floor, the one she wore every Monday. Outside, the February air hit my lungs like ice water. They herded us behind the police line where HR representatives with clipboards were taking names, checking us off lists, handing out emergency blankets that nobody needed but everybody took anyway. The news trucks were already there. Cameras pointed at us like we were a story instead of people. A detective took my statement while I stood there shivering. Not from cold, but from something else. Something that made my muscles contract without my permission. He asked if I recognized the shooter when they showed me a photo on his phone. "Douglas Brennan," he said, "worked for Huntington, recently terminated." The face meant nothing to me, just another downtown office worker, forgettable features, could have been anyone in the elevator. But then the detective asked about Jason Huang from our purchasing department. Did I know him well? Had Jason ever mentioned problems with anyone from Huntington? Did Jason seem worried lately? Jason, who hadn't been in conference room C with us. Jason, who I hadn't seen during the evacuation. The detective's questions painted a picture I didn't want to see. This wasn't random. Brennan had come for Jason specifically, through 3 buildings and 7 floors. They kept us in the Marriott lobby across the plaza for 6 hours while they processed the scene. Pizza appeared at some point, sitting untouched on folding tables while we sat in clusters. Some people crying, some staring at nothing, some calling family members over and over just to hear their voices. Diane finally reached her ex-husband, who picked up their daughter, and she cried so hard she threw up in a wastebasket. Nathan kept refreshing news sites on his phone, reading updates about our own experience like he needed confirmation it really happened. 3 dead in Huntington, 4 in our building, 11 injured. They didn't release names yet, but we knew. We knew Melissa was gone and Robert from conference room B, and Jason, who Brennan had hunted through 3 buildings. Around 8 that evening, they finally let us collect our cars from the parking garage, escorted in small groups, walking past yellow tape and evidence markers. Monday morning, 3 days later, we got an email from corporate. Subject line: important safety update. The company had implemented new security measures, they said. Badge access restrictions, emergency protocol reviews, additional training seminars, They expressed condolences for the tragic incident that occurred in our building complex. Not our building specifically, but the building complex, like it was weather that had passed through instead of a man with a gun hunting one of our coworkers. No mention of Jason by name. No acknowledgement that an employee of ours was the target, that 6 other people died because Douglas Brennan knew Jason worked on our floor. The email ended with information about counseling services and a reminder that the office would reopen Wednesday with grief counselors available in the first-floor lobby. Business continuity, they called it. Essential to maintain operations and support our clients during this difficult time. I never went back. Couldn't walk through those doors knowing what I knew. What we all knew, but what the company wouldn't admit. That Jason had reported Brennan 2 years earlier when they'd worked together at Huntington, something about contract irregularities and kickbacks. That Brennan blamed Jason for his termination. That he'd sent emails, made threats. That Jason had gone to our HR about it just 2 weeks before. That our company knew someone was hunting Jason and did nothing except suggest he park in a different section of the garage. Diane went back for 1 day, collected her things, and quit. Nathan lasted a week. Most of us scattered, found other jobs, other cities even. The company sent out quarterly safety newsletters for a while, reminding employees to report suspicious activity, to participate in active shooter drills, to remember that workplace safety was everyone's responsibility. They never mentioned February, never mentioned Jason. Like if they didn't acknowledge it, it somehow didn't happen in their building, to their employee, on their watch. Corporate life teaches you things they never mention in college. Like how the real danger in an office isn't missing deadlines or botched presentations. It's the people who smile while they tear you apart piece by piece. 26 and fresh into my first legitimate job at an insurance company downtown, I figured the worst part would be the commute, or maybe the endless spreadsheets. My dad spent 30 years at a manufacturing plant before retiring. Always came home with stories about harmless pranks and the occasional shouting match that ended with beers after work. What I witnessed during my 4th month there was something else entirely, something that still makes me check my food twice before taking a bite. The morning it happened started like any other, with that familiar buzz of keyboards and muted phone conversations. But by noon, everything we thought we knew about our coworkers had shifted into something darker. Veronica had been terrorizing that office for 7 years before I arrived, though terrorizing might be too strong a word for what she did, at least on paper. She was a senior analyst, not even management, but she carried herself like she had dirt on everyone from the janitor to the CEO. Walking past her desk felt like crossing a sniper's sight line. You never knew if today was the day she'd pick you as her target. She had mastered this particular brand of cruelty that left no evidence. No trail HR could follow. She'd praise your work while mentioning how impressed she was that someone from your background could adapt so quickly. Or she'd ask about your weekend plans right after discussing her ski trip to Aspen, knowing full well you were living paycheck to paycheck. The way she operated reminded me of those nature documentaries where the predator toys with its prey before the kill. Except Veronica never went for the kill. She preferred to keep her victims alive and suffering. That particular Monday started with Veronica targeting Bethany from accounting, a quiet woman who'd been with the company for 2 years and mostly kept to herself. Bethany had recently started wearing these bright scarves to work, beautiful handmade pieces that her sister sent from Guatemala, where she was doing humanitarian work. They were probably the most colorful things in our beige and gray office, little bursts of life that made Bethany stand out in a way she never had before. I was refilling my water bottle when I heard Veronica's voice carrying across the break room. That fake concerned tone she used right before she went for the jugular. She was asking Bethany about her scarf, running her fingers along the fabric, complimenting the craftsmanship while suggesting that such ethnic patterns were certainly bold choices for a conservative workplace. Then she pivoted, wondering aloud if Bethany was trying to distract from recent weight gain. How clever to draw the eye upward. Though really, had she considered that the bright colors might be doing the opposite of what she intended? I watched Bethany's face crumble in real time, watched her fingers nervously touch the scarf that 5 minutes ago had made her feel beautiful, probably reminded her of her sister, gave her confidence. Veronica kept going, mentioning a weight loss program her friend had success with, pulling up before and after photos on her phone, insisting Bethany take down the number, all while maintaining that poisonous sweetness that made it impossible to call her out without looking like you were overreacting. Other people were in that break room, at least 4 of us, and we all just stood there, frozen, afraid to intervene because we knew we'd be next. Bethany mumbled something about needing to get back to her desk, and as she hurried past me, I saw tears streaming down her face. Veronica just smiled and stirred her coffee, satisfied, like a cat that had just torn apart a mouse for sport. That was Wednesday, and by Friday morning, Veronica would be on the floor of that same break room, gasping for air while her face swelled up like a balloon. Wednesday afternoon dragged on with this heavy tension you could practically taste in the recycled office air. Bethany didn't come back after lunch, sent an email about feeling sick, and we all knew exactly what kind of sick she meant. I kept replaying the break room scene in my head while trying to focus on insurance claims, but my mind kept drifting to all the times I'd witnessed similar attacks. There was Tom from IT who stopped wearing his vintage band shirts after Veronica suggested he was trying too hard to seem young and hip for someone balding at 34. There was Monica, who used to bring homemade Filipino food, until Veronica complained about the smell and started a whole discussion about professional courtesy in shared spaces. Each person dimmed a little after their encounter with Veronica, like she was slowly draining the color from our office one victim at a time. The worst part was how she'd act completely normal afterward, chatting about weekend plans or asking for recipe recommendations as if she hadn't just destroyed someone's confidence an hour earlier. I need to tell you about Friday morning because even now, months later, I can still see every detail like it's burned into my retinas. Veronica always ate lunch at exactly noon, had this whole ritual where she'd heat up her meal prep container, usually some trendy diet food she'd post on Instagram, arrange everything perfectly on her plate, and eat at the round table by the window. She kept her lunch in the same spot in the fridge every day, top shelf, left corner, with her initials written in purple Sharpie on the lid. That Friday, she grabbed her container like always, heated up what looked like quinoa salad with grilled chicken and pine nuts, and sat down with her phone propped up against her water bottle, probably scrolling through social media or reading those toxic productivity blogs she loved to quote. I was microwaving my sad frozen burrito when she took her first bite, and then her second, and then everything went sideways fast. First, she started coughing. Not like when you swallow wrong, but these deep, rattling coughs that made everyone in the break room turn around. Her hand went to her throat, and I saw her eyes go wide. Real fear replacing that usual smugness for the first time since I'd known her. She stood up so fast her chair tipped backward, crashing against the floor. And that's when I noticed her lips were already swelling, turning this unnatural shade of purple red. She tried to speak but only managed these horrible wheezing sounds, like air being forced through a straw that was getting smaller and smaller. Her face started changing shape right in front of us, her eyelids puffing up until she could barely see, hives spreading across her neck like someone was painting them on in real time. She fumbled for her purse, knocking her perfectly arranged lunch across the table, quinoa and chicken scattering everywhere, and that's when she collapsed, her knees just giving out like someone had cut her strings. The next few minutes were absolute chaos, the kind that makes time move both too fast and too slow simultaneously. Phil from sales was already on the phone with 911, his voice shaking as he tried to describe what was happening, while Gloria from HR dropped to her knees beside Veronica, asking if anyone knew if she had allergies, if she carried an EpiPen. Veronica was making these terrifying, gasping sounds, her whole body jerking with the effort to breathe, and her face had swollen so much she was almost unrecognizable. Someone found an EpiPen in her purse, thank God, and Gloria jabbed it into her thigh right through her dress pants. but it barely seemed to help. I stood there holding my half-heated burrito, unable to move, unable to look away from this woman who had terrorized us for years, now fighting for every breath. The paramedics arrived in what felt like hours, but was probably only 6 or 7 minutes, and they worked on her with this urgent efficiency that made it clear how serious this was. They got her on a stretcher, oxygen mask over her swollen face, and rushed her out while we all stood there in stunned silence, the break room still smelling like microwaved quinoa and fear. After the ambulance left, we all just stood there staring at the mess on the floor, the overturned chair, her phone still propped against her water bottle with some influencer's perfect life frozen on the screen. Gloria was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper, asking if anyone knew what Veronica was allergic to, and that's when the reality of what just happened started sinking in. Someone had put something in her food, something they knew would trigger this reaction, and we all knew it, but nobody wanted to say it out loud. Security showed up about 20 minutes later, started asking questions, taking photos of the break room, bagging up what was left of her lunch, but the damage was already done. The cameras in the break room had been down for 3 weeks, something about a system upgrade that kept getting delayed, and everyone knew it. HR sent us all home early, told us to expect a call over the weekend, but that call never came, at least not the kind we were expecting. Monday morning arrived with an email from corporate, one of those carefully worded messages that said everything and nothing at the same time. Veronica was recovering, would be taking an extended medical leave, and the company was conducting a thorough investigation into what they called an unfortunate incident. They reminded us about food allergy awareness, announced new protocols for food storage in common areas, and stressed that tampering with anyone's food was not only against company policy, but also illegal. What they didn't mention was that Bethany had submitted her resignation Friday afternoon, effective immediately, about 2 hours after Veronica was taken away in that ambulance. They also didn't mention that the security footage from the hallway leading to the break room, the only cameras that were working, showed at least 15 people going in and out that morning, including Bethany, who had supposedly called in sick. The investigation went on for weeks, interviews with everyone, polygraph tests that were voluntary but didn't feel voluntary, and through it all, this suffocating cloud of suspicion that made every interaction feel loaded with hidden meaning. The office changed after that Friday, transformed into something unrecognizable, even though all the furniture stayed in the same places. People started eating at their desks exclusively, keeping their food in locked containers or mini fridges they bought themselves, treating the communal kitchen like it was contaminated. Conversations became purely transactional. Nobody wanted to risk saying something that might be taken the wrong way, might make them a target for whoever had done this to Veronica. The scariest part was how many people I heard whispering that while they didn't condone what happened, they understood it, and that terrified me more than the actual poisoning. We all knew Veronica had pushed someone past their breaking point, but the fact that someone in our office, someone who sat through meetings with us and made small talk by the printer, had deliberately tried to kill her, or at least seriously harm her, that knowledge sat in our stomachs like a stone. Tom from IT quit 2 weeks later, said he couldn't handle the atmosphere anymore, and Monica transferred to the branch across town, taking a pay cut just to get away from what our office had become. Veronica never came back to work, officially took early retirement with a generous settlement that came with an ironclad non-disclosure agreement, or at least that's what we heard through the gossip network that somehow survived even in our new culture of silence. Bethany disappeared completely, her LinkedIn deleted, her social media accounts gone like she'd never existed at all, though sometimes I wonder if she's out there somewhere, finally free from Veronica's shadow but carrying the weight of what she might have done. The company brought in consultants, team-building experts, even a workplace therapist, but nothing could fix what had broken that Friday. I lasted another 3 months before I found a new job, and during my exit interview, when they asked why I was leaving, I just said I needed a change of scenery. What I didn't say was that every time I opened the office fridge, I thought about how easy it had been for someone to nearly kill a coworker, How we'd all watched Veronica torment people for years and done nothing. How in the end, we became the kind of workplace where attempted murder felt like justice to someone. Now I work from home, make my own lunch, and sometimes late at night I still think about that moment when Veronica's eyes went wide with fear, when she realized someone she'd pushed too far had pushed back in the worst possible way, and I wonder if she ever understood that she'd created the very monster that almost killed her. Everyone at the warehouse knew me as the guy who actually gave a damn about inventory accuracy. 26 candles on my last birthday cake, 4 years since college, and I was still scanning packages at Midwest Logistics, while my roommate from freshman year was already pulling 6 figures at some tech startup. But I had a plan, and that Tuesday in early November was supposed to be when everything changed. My supervisor Craig had been dangling this operations coordinator position for months, dropping hints during smoke breaks, telling me to be patient, that good things come to those who wait. When he finally called me into his office that afternoon, right after the lunch trucks finished loading, I thought my persistence had paid off. Craig's office sat in the corner of the warehouse, one of those prefab structures with thin walls and a window overlooking the loading docks. He had this habit of keeping the blinds half closed, creating these weird shadows across his desk that made everything feel like a confession booth. I remember knocking twice, hearing his voice call me in, and finding him leaning back in his chair with his feet up on the desk, work boots still caked with yesterday's mud. He smiled when he saw me, but it was different from his usual grin, the kind he'd flash when telling dirty jokes by the forklift. This smile stayed too long on his face, like he was savoring something before swallowing it. "Close the door behind you, champ," he said, and I did. Even though we usually kept doors open during one-on-ones, company policy about transparency and all that. The conversation started normal enough, Craig asking about my weekend, whether I caught the game Sunday night, regular boss small talk that usually meant he was warming up to something bigger. I sat in the metal folding chair across from his desk, the one with the uneven leg that rocked if you shifted your weight, and waited for him to get to the point about the coordinator position. He talked about the company's growth, how corporate was impressed with our numbers, how he needed someone he could trust in a management role. Then he stood up, walked around the desk, and sat on its edge, right in front of me, close enough that I could smell the Copenhagen on his breath. "You want this promotion, right?" he asked. And when I nodded, probably too eagerly, he continued, "Good, because I've been watching you, and I think you understand what loyalty means around here." At first, I thought he meant staying late without overtime complaints, covering shifts when people called in sick, the usual workplace dedication speech every boss gives before adding more to your plate. But Craig kept going, explaining how loyalty meant understanding that some conversations never leave his office, that good employees know when to speak up and when to stay quiet, that gratitude wasn't just saying thank you, but showing it in ways that mattered. His hand landed on my shoulder while he talked, heavy and warm through my polo shirt, and he squeezed just hard enough to make his point without leaving marks. "The thing about opportunities," he said, leaning closer, "is they come with expectations, and I need to know you're mature enough to handle those expectations without making things complicated." The fluorescent light above us hummed and flickered, casting his face in and out of shadow, and I noticed for the first time that he'd locked the door after I closed it. I tried to lean back in the wobbly chair, create some distance, but there was nowhere to go, just Craig's presence filling the small office like smoke from a fire you can't locate. He started talking about other employees who'd disappointed him, people who'd confused professional boundaries with personal attacks, who didn't understand that success required sacrifice and flexibility. His examples got more specific, mentioning Amy from receiving who'd filed a complaint last year before suddenly transferring to the night shift, then quitting altogether. "She didn't understand the game," he said, his fingers drumming against the desk beside my arm, each tap deliberate and measured. "But you're smarter than that, aren't you? You've been here long enough to know how things really work, how sometimes you need to trust your supervisor's judgment, even when it doesn't make complete sense at first. The promotion paperwork was right there on his desk. I could see my name typed on the top form. The salary increase that would finally let me move out of my studio apartment, maybe even start paying down those student loans faster. Craig followed my eyes to the papers and grinned wider, picking up the stack and fanning them out like a poker hand. $48,000 a year, he said, plus benefits, plus my personal mentorship, which is worth more than money if you're smart enough to appreciate it. He put the papers in his desk drawer, locked it, and pocketed the key. Then he pulled out his personal phone, not the company one, and asked for my number, said he preferred texting for urgent matters. That email left too much of a paper trail for efficient communication. When I hesitated, his expression shifted, not angry exactly, but disappointed, like a teacher catching a promising student cheating on a test. Trust, he said slowly, is a two-way street, and right now you're standing at a crossroads. I gave him my number, watched him type it into his phone with thick fingers that seemed to take forever hitting each digit, and immediately felt my own phone buzz in my pocket. His first text was already there. Good choice. He told me the promotion would be official by Friday, but there were some training sessions he wanted to handle personally, after hours, to make sure I was ready for the responsibility. The way he said after hours made my chest tighten, but I nodded, told myself this was just how advancement worked, that everyone had to pay their dues somehow. Craig stood up, finally giving me room to breathe, and walked to the door, unlocking it with a casual motion like the last 20 minutes had been a normal performance review. "Oh, one more thing," he said, turning back to face me. "This conversation stays between us, understood? Corporate doesn't need to know every detail about how I develop my team, and neither does anyone else in the warehouse. Discretion is the first lesson in management." That night, the texts started coming around 10:30, just as I was getting ready for bed. First one was innocent enough, asking if I could come in an hour early tomorrow to review some paperwork. Then another at 11, reminding me to wear something presentable for our morning meeting. By midnight, he'd sent 4 more messages, each one slightly more personal than the last, asking about my living situation, whether I had a girlfriend, if I ever felt lonely working so much. I didn't respond to any of them, just lay there staring at my phone screen lighting up in the dark, each buzz making my apartment feel smaller and smaller. The last text came at 1:15 in the morning, just 2 words that made sleep impossible. "You awake?" I turned off my phone completely, something I never did in case of family emergencies, and spent the rest of the night listening to every sound in my building, wondering if that was a car door slamming or just my neighbor coming home late. Wednesday morning came too fast and not fast enough. That weird paradox of dreading something while desperately wanting it to be over. I arrived at my usual time, not the hour early Craig had requested, and found my schedule completely rearranged on the assignment board. Instead of my regular receiving duties, I was assigned to solo inventory in the back warehouse, the section we called the dungeon because of its broken lights and distance from everyone else. Craig was waiting there when I arrived, leaning against a stack of pallets with a clipboard, acting like it was perfectly normal for a supervisor to personally oversee routine inventory counts. "Sleep well?" he asked, and the way he emphasized the word sleep made it clear he knew exactly when I'd turned off my phone. For the next 3 hours, he shadowed me through the aisles, never quite touching, but always close enough that I could feel his presence, asking questions about my counting methods, my organizational preferences, whether I preferred working alone or with a partner. The pattern established itself over the next 2 weeks like a noose tightening one twist at a time. If I didn't respond to his late-night texts fast enough, my schedule would mysteriously change, putting me on the loading dock during the coldest hours or assigning me to clean the break room during my usual lunch period. When I did respond, keeping things professional and brief, he'd find reasons to call me into his office, each meeting a little longer than the last, each conversation pushing boundaries a little further. He started sharing details about his divorce, his custody battle, how lonely leadership could be, always punctuating these confessions with comments about trust and loyalty and understanding. Other employees began avoiding me, not obviously, but in that way people distanced themselves from someone marked by authority's attention. Even Larry, who'd trained me 4 years ago and usually had a joke for everything, stopped making eye contact when we passed in the aisles. By the 3rd week, I was surviving on 3 hours of sleep a night, jumping at every notification sound, screening calls from numbers I didn't recognize because Craig had started calling from different phones when I didn't answer his personal cell. My work performance tanked, simple inventory counts taking twice as long because I couldn't focus, couldn't stop checking exits, couldn't shake the feeling that he was always watching even when his office door was closed. The promotion paperwork never materialized, of course, though Craig kept mentioning it was in process whenever I tried to bring it up. Instead, he started suggesting we discuss my future over drinks after work, maybe dinner on Saturday to really dive deep into career planning. When I declined, citing a family obligation that didn't exist, he assigned me to work that exact Saturday. Over time, I couldn't afford to refuse given my student loan payment was due. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon in December when I finally went to HR, sitting across from Linda in her clean, organized office that felt like a different universe from Craig's cave. I told her everything, showed her the texts on my phone, explained the schedule changes, the isolation, the constant surveillance disguised as mentorship. She took notes, nodded sympathetically, asked if I'd explicitly told Craig to stop contacting me outside of work hours. When I said no, not in those exact words, her expression shifted slightly, professionally neutral but somehow dismissive. She explained that Craig's communication style might be unconventional, but without explicit harassment or discrimination, it fell into a gray area of management discretion. The texts I showed her were gone when I looked again during our meeting, somehow deleted from my phone even though I knew I hadn't touched them. Linda suggested I document everything going forward, maintain professional boundaries, and come back if anything concrete happened. Craig knew about my HR visit before I even made it back to the warehouse floor. I could see it in his face when he passed me near the loading dock, that particular smile that meant he was 3 steps ahead and enjoying the view. That night, no texts came, no calls, nothing but silence that felt louder than all his previous messages combined. The next morning, I found myself assigned to work with a crew transferring to our satellite facility 40 miles away, a temporary assignment that would last indefinitely according to the schedule. My access card stopped working for the main office area. IT said it was a system glitch they'd fix eventually. The promotion posting disappeared from the internal job board, and when I asked about it, I was told the position had been eliminated due to restructuring. Coworkers who'd previously just avoided me now looked at me with something between pity and relief. Like I was a cautionary tale they were grateful not to be living. I quit 2 weeks later, walking out in the middle of a shift because I couldn't stand another day of exile, another night of wondering when the silence would break, another morning of checking my phone for messages that never came but somehow still controlled my entire existence. No reference, no unemployment eligibility, just gone with 4 years of my life reduced to a gap on my resume I still struggle to explain in interviews. 6 months later, I heard through a former coworker that Craig had promoted someone new to operations coordinator, a young guy fresh from college who apparently understood the importance of loyalty and gratitude. They said Craig keeps a photo from the kid's promotion ceremony on his desk, right where anyone sitting in that wobbly metal chair would have to see it. Sometimes I still wake up at 1:15 in the morning, phone in hand before I'm fully conscious, checking for messages that aren't there from a number I blocked but memorized, waiting for a conversation that ended but never really stopped. Insurance adjusting isn't glamorous work, but after graduating college in 2011, I needed something stable, while everyone else was still recovering from the recession. Our office in downtown Portland only had 12 employees, tucked into the fourth floor of a building that used to house a department store in the 70s. Most mornings, I'd arrive around 8:30, grab coffee from the break room that always smelled faintly of burnt popcorn, and settle into my cubicle near the window. It was predictable, comfortable even, the kind of job where you knew everyone's lunch orders and whose kid had soccer practice on Wednesdays. That February morning when Harold started, I remember thinking how exhausted he looked, like someone had drained all the color from his face and forgotten to put it back. Harold took the empty desk 3 cubicles down from mine, the one that had been vacant since Carolyn retired. During his first week, he kept entirely to himself, eating lunch at his desk while staring at his computer screen, never joining our Friday afternoon conversations about weekend plans. I noticed him because of how deliberately unnoticeable he tried to be, if that makes sense. He wore the same style of gray polo shirt every day, just in different shades, and moved through the office like he was afraid of taking up too much space. About 2 weeks in, I found him in the break room during lunch, heating up a single serving of instant soup, and something about the way he stood there watching the microwave timer count down made my chest tight with recognition. I knew that posture, that hollow look. My brother had worn it for months after his own marriage fell apart. Maybe that's why I started bringing extra portions of dinner leftovers, casually mentioning I'd made too much pasta, or that my slow cooker recipes always served 6, even though I lived alone. Harold would hesitate at first, his fingers drumming against his desk before accepting, always insisting he'd bring something next time to make it even. He never did, but I didn't mind. We started eating together in the break room, and gradually he began sharing fragments of his story. His ex-wife had kept the house in Beaverton. Their daughter visited every other weekend, and he was renting a studio apartment near the river that got terrible water pressure, but had a nice view of the bridge. Normal divorce stuff, painful but manageable, the kind of life readjustment thousands of people navigate every year. By April, our lunch routine had evolved into something comfortable. Harold would wait for me by the elevator at noon, holding the door even when I was running late from a phone call. He started contributing to conversations, offering surprisingly funny observations about our coworkers' habits, like how Martin always cleared his throat exactly 3 times before answering his phone, or how Sheila rearranged her desk plants based on her mood. I genuinely enjoyed his company. When he mentioned he'd never tried the Mediterranean place 2 blocks over, I suggested we walk there on Friday, and his face lit up like I'd offered him a winning lottery ticket. That should have registered as unusual, that intensity of reaction. But loneliness can make people grateful for small kindnesses. I understood that, or thought I did. The text messages started innocently enough. Harold had asked for my number after I'd offered to send him a recipe for the lemon chicken I'd brought one day, and initially his messages were sparse, appropriate. A thank you for lunch, a joke about something that happened in the office, a picture of his attempt at the recipe that had turned out surprisingly well. But by early May, I was waking up to multiple messages every morning. Photos of his breakfast with comments about what I might be eating, observations about the weather and whether I'd dressed warm enough, links to articles about topics I'd mentioned once in passing weeks ago. He'd apparently cataloged every casual comment I'd made. When I mentioned liking jazz during one lunch conversation, I received daily YouTube links to obscure jazz recordings at exactly 6 a.m., each with a lengthy paragraph about why this particular piece reminded him of something I'd said or done. One Monday in mid-May, I decided to eat lunch at my desk to catch up on paperwork, sending Harold a quick text that I couldn't make our usual break room meeting. Within 3 minutes, he was standing at my cubicle, holding 2 sandwiches from the deli downstairs, insisting he'd bought too much by accident. When I explained I really needed to focus on work, his jaw tightened in this peculiar way, like he was physically holding words inside his mouth. He set the sandwich on my desk anyway, then pulled up a chair from an empty cubicle and sat there eating his lunch while I worked, occasionally commenting on my typing speed or asking about the claim I was reviewing. Every time I glanced up, he was watching me, not eating, just watching with this slight smile that made my scalp prickle. After that day, Eating lunch alone became impossible. He'd always appear with food, acting like we'd planned it. I started leaving the office for lunch, telling everyone I had errands to run or appointments to keep. Harold would text asking where I was, if everything was okay, if he'd done something wrong. 15, 20 messages in an hour. When I returned, he'd be waiting by my desk with this wounded expression, asking why I hadn't responded. Didn't I see his messages? I tried being direct but gentle, explaining that I needed some space, that friendship required boundaries. He nodded along, apologizing profusely, promising to dial it back. The next morning, there were 36 roses on my desk with a card that read, "For being such a patient friend," and my coworkers were all smiling and making assumptions that made me want to crawl under my desk. When I told Harold the roses were inappropriate, he looked genuinely confused, insisted they were just a friendly gesture, that I was reading too much into it. Martin overheard and joked that I should be flattered, and Harold latched onto that immediately, repeating it whenever I tried to establish distance. The breaking point came on a Saturday in early June. I was at the farmer's market with my sister when I spotted Harold 3 stalls behind us, poorly hidden behind a display of hanging plants. When we moved to the next vendor, he followed. When we stopped for coffee, he sat 2 tables away with a newspaper held up to his face like some cartoon detective. My sister noticed him too, asked if that was the coworker I'd mentioned had been getting clingy. Clingy didn't begin to cover it anymore. I confronted him right there, walked straight to his table while my sister filmed on her phone just in case. Harold's face crumpled like a child caught stealing candy. He swore it was a coincidence, that he came to this market every Saturday, had been coming for years, but when I asked him to name a single vendor or what he'd bought, he just stared at me with those pale gray eyes getting wet around the edges, then stood up and walked away without another word. I thought that public embarrassment might have finally gotten through to him. Monday at work, Harold wasn't at his desk. Neither was his computer, his coffee mug, the small cactus he kept by his monitor. For one beautiful moment, I thought he'd quit, maybe realized he'd crossed too many lines. But then I found out from Sheila that he'd requested to move to the 3rd floor, told management he needed a quieter workspace to focus better. The relief I felt was physical, like someone had removed a weight from my chest. For 2 weeks, everything felt normal again. I could eat lunch in peace, check my phone without finding dozens of messages, walk to my car after work without constantly scanning the parking lot. I even started staying late again to catch up on the backlog I'd accumulated while trying to avoid Harold. That false sense of security was exactly what he was counting on, I realize now. The notes started appearing on my car in late June, tucked under the windshield wiper like parking tickets. The first one was just a single line, "I miss our lunches." No signature, but the handwriting was unmistakably Harold's, that cramped, precise script I'd seen on countless forms. I threw it away, didn't mention it to anyone. The next day there was another. "You looked nice in the blue dress yesterday." I hadn't seen Harold at all that day, hadn't even known he was watching. They escalated quickly after that. Details about what I'd eaten for dinner, visible through my apartment window. Comments about the TV shows I watched, the glow apparently visible from the street. Observations about my morning routine, what time I turned on the bathroom light, how long my showers lasted. I filed a report with building security, but they said without proof it was Harold, without any explicit threats. There wasn't much they could do beyond increasing patrols in the garage. The police said essentially the same thing when I went to them with a folder full of the notes. Then my mother started getting Facebook friend requests from someone claiming to be my boyfriend, using photos stolen from my Instagram, but with Harold's face poorly photoshopped over whoever I'd been standing next to. My cousin received LinkedIn messages about what a wonderful couple Harold and I made, how we were planning to move in together soon. My landlord called asking about my fiancé who'd stopped by to look at adding his name to the lease, describing Harold perfectly, even though I'd never once brought him to my apartment building. I changed my locks, installed a doorbell camera, started parking in different spots each day. I documented everything, built a case file that would make any detective proud. HR at work said they'd spoken to Harold about maintaining professional boundaries, but since nothing was happening on company property anymore, their hands were tied. I was drowning in bureaucracy while Harold was systematically inserting himself into every corner of my life, and everyone around me seemed to think I was overreacting to someone who was just lonely or probably harmless. The night everything unraveled was a Wednesday in July, one of those humid Portland evenings where the air feels too thick to breathe properly. I'd stayed late at the office finishing a complex claim, the building mostly empty except for the cleaning crew. Around 9:30, I finally packed up and headed to the parking garage, my keys between my fingers like I'd been doing for weeks. My car was the only one left on level 2 besides a maintenance van, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows between the concrete pillars. As I approached my car, I noticed something off about my driver's side door. It was unlocked, slightly ajar, though I distinctly remembered the click of the locks when I'd left that morning. My phone was already in my hand, 911 pre-dialed, when I heard footsteps echoing from the stairwell. Not running, just walking steadily, purposefully. I ran to my car, jumped in, and locked the doors just as Harold emerged from the shadows, carrying a box of my things from my desk. Items I hadn't even noticed were missing. He stood there in the harsh garage lighting, looking confused and hurt, like I was the one behaving strangely. I called 911 right there, windows up, doors locked, while Harold stood 5 feet away from my car holding that box like some demented delivery man. He kept talking, though I couldn't hear the words through the glass, his mouth moving frantically. His free hand gesturing at the box, at me, at himself. The police arrived within 10 minutes that felt like hours, and Harold actually smiled when he saw them, like they'd come to mediate a simple misunderstanding. While the officers separated us for questioning, one of them went back into the building with security to review the footage from the past week. What they found made even the veteran cop's face go pale. Harold had been entering the building almost every night using a copied key card, sitting at my desk for hours in the dark, going through my drawers, my computer, even eating the snacks I kept in my bottom drawer. The footage from just 3 hours earlier showed him at my desk, while I was in the conference room down the hall, completely unaware. He'd been doing this for weeks, maybe longer, living some twisted fantasy where my workspace was his, where my life was his to examine and document. They arrested Harold that night for breaking and entering, trespassing, and theft. During the investigation, they found journals at his apartment filled with detailed logs of my daily activities, printed screenshots of every social media post I'd ever made, photos of me taken from distances with a telephoto lens, and worst of all, a wedding planning book where he'd pasted my face next to his in various venue brochures. He'd already put deposits down at 2 locations for the following spring. The restraining order went through immediately, and Harold was terminated from the company the next day. He pled guilty to avoid trial, got 18 months probation and mandatory counseling. I never went back to that office. I couldn't sit at that desk knowing he'd been there in the darkness, touching my things, breathing in my space, pretending we shared something that existed only in his fractured mind. I moved to a different neighborhood, changed jobs, deleted most of my social media. 6 months later, I heard through a former coworker that Harold had moved to Idaho to live with his elderly parents. I still check my rearview mirror too often, still feel my chest tighten when I see gray polo shirts, still triple-check my locks before bed. Some violations of trust leave marks that don't fade. They just become part of your routine, woven into the fabric of how you move through the world. I started the engine and drove straight to the police station, Harold's figure shrinking in my rearview mirror, still standing in that same spot holding that box. The officers took my statement, said they'd increase patrols around my apartment, suggested a restraining order. But what happened next changed everything. The next morning, our head of security, Walter, pulled me aside with his laptop, his face pale and serious. He'd been reviewing footage from the past month after my parking garage incident, going through the overnight recordings that normally nobody checked. What he showed me made my entire body go cold. There was Harold, using a key card to enter the building at 2, 3 in the morning, multiple times a week. The cameras showed him going to the 4th floor, to our old department. He'd sit at my desk for hours in the complete darkness, just sitting in my chair, going through my drawers, typing on my keyboard, even though the computer was off. In one recording from just 3 nights ago, he'd brought a blanket and pillow, sleeping under my desk until 5 a.m. before leaving through the stairwell. Walter had checked the keycard logs. Harold had reported his card stolen weeks ago and gotten a replacement, but had clearly kept the original and been using it for his midnight visits. The police arrested Harold that afternoon at his apartment, where they found notebooks filled with detailed logs of my daily activities, hundreds of photos of me taken without my knowledge, and most disturbingly, a set of keys they matched to my apartment, copies he'd somehow had made, though thankfully my recent lock change had rendered them useless. He'd been entering the office for 6 weeks, they determined, starting right after he'd moved to the 3rd floor. The security footage also revealed he'd installed something under my desk, a tiny recording device that picked up my phone conversations, which explained how he knew so much about my schedule and personal life. Harold was charged with stalking, breaking and entering, and unlawful surveillance. He took a plea deal for 2 years in prison and a permanent restraining order. I never went back to that office. The company transferred me to their Seattle branch with a small settlement to avoid any liability issues, and I started fresh in a new city. That was 3 years ago. I still check my rearview mirror too often, still feel my chest tighten when I see someone in a gray polo shirt, still can't shake the image of him sleeping under my desk, curled up in the exact spot where my feet would go, like he was trying to exist in the negative space of my life. April has always been my favorite month in Seattle, when the rain finally starts to let up, and you can actually see Mount Rainier from the office windows. I'd been working at Holloway Architecture for about 18 months, long enough to know everyone's coffee order and which printer would jam if you looked at it wrong. We were a small firm, just 12 of us crammed into the 7th floor of a converted warehouse downtown, the kind of place where everyone wore multiple hats, and the holiday party was just ordering Thai food and drinking wine from coffee mugs. Most days felt like working with an extended family, which made what happened next feel like such a profound betrayal that even now, 2 years later, I still check every smoke detector in every room I enter. It was Charlotte who found it first, though she didn't realize what she was looking at initially. She'd been standing on the toilet seat trying to open the bathroom window that had been painted shut since probably the Clinton administration, when she noticed the smoke detector above the stalls looked different from the one in the hallway. The LED light that should have been green was red, and there was this tiny black circle in the center that definitely wasn't there on the other detectors. She mentioned it to me during lunch, more curious than concerned, wondering if maybe building maintenance had upgraded just that one for some reason. But something about it nagged at me all afternoon, that little detail scratching at the back of my mind like a song you can't quite remember. Around 3 that afternoon, I couldn't focus on the residential plans spread across my desk anymore. I told myself I was being ridiculous as I walked to the women's bathroom, but I locked the door behind me anyway. Standing on the same toilet seat Charlotte had used, I got my first close look at that smoke detector. My stomach did this weird flip when I saw it properly, because that black circle wasn't just different, it was a camera lens. I actually laughed at first, this nervous, disbelieving sound that echoed off the tile walls, because things like this happened in news stories about gas stations or sketchy motels, not in your own office where you knew everyone by their kids' names and their favorite basketball teams. I climbed down and sat right there on the bathroom floor for a minute, trying to process what this meant. The detector had been there since before I started. I was sure of it, which meant someone had been recording every woman in our office for God knows how long. Every time we'd adjusted our clothes, fixed our makeup, had private phone conversations during rough days, changed after cycling to work in the morning, someone had been watching. The violation of it hit me in waves, each realization worse than the last. and I had to grip the edge of the sink to stop myself from either screaming or throwing up. Charlotte was still at her desk when I practically dragged her into the conference room, my voice shaking as I told her what I'd found. Her face went through this progression of expressions, from confusion to disbelief to a kind of horror that made her whole body seem to shrink into itself. We called in Priya, our office manager, and watched her normally composed demeanor completely crumble as she processed what we were telling her. Within an hour, all 5 women in the office were huddled in that conference room, speaking in hushed voices like we were afraid the walls might be listening too. The men were still working at their desks, oblivious to the bomb that had just gone off in our professional lives. Priya said we needed to call the police immediately, but first she wanted to document everything. She put on latex gloves from the first aid kit, stood on a chair she'd brought from the conference room, and carefully unscrewed the fake smoke detector. The thing came away from the ceiling easily, too easily, with just a battery pack attached to the back and a small memory card tucked into a slot on the side. Looking at it sitting there on the conference table, this cheap piece of hardware that you could probably buy online for $30 made everything feel surreal and impossibly sorted at the same time. We could see the real smoke detector underneath where the fake had been mounted, painted over like it had been covered for years. The police arrived within the hour, 2 officers who seemed almost as uncomfortable as we were. They bagged the device as evidence and took statements from each of us separately, asking when we'd first noticed anything unusual, who had access to the bathroom, whether we'd seen anyone acting suspiciously. The younger officer, a woman who couldn't have been more than 25, kept apologizing like she was personally responsible for what had happened to us. While they were processing the scene, Walter, our senior partner, finally noticed the commotion and came over to ask what was going on. I'll never forget the way his face changed when Priya explained, this slow-motion collapse from confusion to shock, to something that looked almost like panic. By 5:30, everyone knew. The men in the office stood around in awkward clusters, not making eye contact with any of us, like they'd all been collectively accused of something. Walter called an emergency meeting, his voice cracking as he promised a full investigation. Said he'd already called our building management and our IT contractor to check if anyone had requested access to that bathroom recently. He kept running his hand through what was left of his gray hair, repeating that in 30 years of running this firm, nothing like this had ever happened. But here's what made my skin crawl. Every single man in that room had a key card that could access the women's bathroom after hours for maintenance or emergencies, a detail I'd never thought twice about until that moment. The forensics tech who came the next day was this methodical woman who spent 3 hours examining the memory card while we all pretended to work. She told us the footage went back 14 months, with motion-activated recordings that captured everything during business hours. 14 months of private moments, stored on a card smaller than a quarter. She said whoever did this had been downloading the footage regularly, probably monthly, replacing the batteries at the same time. The level of planning made me physically ill. The idea that someone had marked their calendar for their monthly violation ritual, probably stayed late on a Friday or came in on a weekend when no one would notice. Charlotte quit that same week, didn't even work out her 2 weeks' notice, just packed her desk and left. I couldn't blame her. The rest of us tried to maintain some normalcy, but it was impossible. Every conversation felt loaded, every interaction suspect. We started using the bathroom on the 3rd floor, taking the stairs just to avoid running into the men from our office in the elevator. Priya installed a new lock on the women's bathroom that required a special code only the 5 of us knew, but it felt like putting a Band-Aid on a severed artery. The damage was already done, the trust completely shattered, and we all knew one of the 7 men we worked with every day had done this to us. HR brought in a specialist from some consulting firm, a woman in an expensive suit, who conducted individual interviews with everyone, asking probing questions about office dynamics and whether we'd noticed any inappropriate behavior. She set up a tip line, promised complete anonymity, talked about implementing new security protocols and mandatory training sessions. Walter sent out daily emails about the investigation's progress, which was basically no progress at all. The police said without DNA evidence or fingerprints, which the person had been careful not to leave, and without any distinguishing features in the footage that could identify who installed it, they had very little to go on. The memory card was a generic brand sold everywhere, the device ordered online with no way to trace the buyer. 3 weeks passed in this suffocating limbo. We'd get updates that led nowhere, promises that something would be done, assurances that they were taking this seriously, but every day we had to walk into that office, sit across from our male colleagues in meetings, pretend to collaborate on projects while wondering which one had watched us in our most vulnerable moments. I started having dreams about it, would wake up at 3 in the morning convinced I could feel eyes on me even in my own apartment. The worst part was how normal everyone acted, how they all expressed the right amount of outrage and sympathy, every single one of them playing the part of the shocked and supportive colleague perfectly. Then came the Monday morning that changed everything. I arrived early, around 7, hoping to get some work done before everyone else showed up and the pretense of normalcy began. The office was quiet, just the hum of computers that never got turned off, and the distant sound of traffic from the street below. I went to make coffee in the kitchen, and when I came back to my desk, Priya was standing in the hallway outside the women's bathroom, her face pale as printer paper. She had her phone in one hand and was gesturing frantically with the other for me to come over. My coffee mug slipped from my hand when I saw what she was looking at. Brown liquid spreading across the carpet in a pattern I'd still see weeks later every time I closed my eyes. There was a new smoke detector installed above the toilet. Same spot, same angle. But this one was white instead of beige, with a tiny green LED that blinked every few seconds like it was winking at us. The original fake one was still in police evidence. The real one was still painted over on the ceiling, which meant someone had brought in a third device and installed it over the weekend. Someone who still had access to the building, who knew the investigation had stalled, who was confident enough or desperate enough to do it again. Priya's hands shook as she called Walter, then the police, then started taking photos from every angle. I just stood there, frozen, because this meant the person wasn't some outside contractor or former employee like we'd been hoping. They were still here, still watching, and they wanted us to know they weren't going to stop. The police arrived faster this time, and they weren't playing around. They sealed off the entire floor, brought in a forensics team that dusted every surface for prints, pulled security footage from the building's cameras. The detective, a tired-looking man named Ramirez who'd been handling our case, stood in Walter's office with his arms crossed, explaining that whoever did this had used the emergency stairwell to avoid the main cameras, but there should be key card data showing who accessed the building over the weekend. Walter's assistant pulled the records while we all waited in the conference room, the 7 men separated from us women like we were opposing teams in some horrible game. The key card data showed that 4 people had been in the building over the weekend. Walter himself on Saturday morning, saying he'd come to catch up on emails. Our IT guy, Paul, on Saturday afternoon for scheduled server maintenance. Junior architect Colin on Sunday evening to grab files he'd forgotten. And surprisingly, Richard, our 60-year-old structural engineer who said he'd been meeting a client. Each of them had perfectly reasonable explanations, documentation to back up their stories, alibis that couldn't quite be verified but couldn't be disproven either. The security footage was useless, showing nothing but empty hallways and closed doors, the stairwell cameras conveniently experiencing a glitch during the crucial hours. It was like watching someone play chess when you could only see half the board, knowing they were making moves you couldn't track. That afternoon, Walter made an executive decision. He sent all the women home with full pay, said we could work remotely while they sorted this out, installed new security cameras in every hallway and common area. The men would continue coming to the office, he said, where they'd be under constant surveillance. He hired a private investigator, a former FBI agent who specialized in corporate espionage cases. She interviewed each of the weekend visitors multiple times, pushing for inconsistencies, checking their devices, examining their home computers with signed consent that they couldn't refuse without looking guilty. Paul broke first, not because he was guilty, but because the stress gave him a panic attack so severe they had to call an ambulance. Colin threatened to sue for harassment. Richard just sat there during each interview with this eerily calm expression, answering every question in measured tones. The breakthrough came from the last place anyone expected. The building's cleaning lady, Maria, who came in Sunday nights, reached out to Priya after hearing about the investigation. She said she'd seen something odd weeks before the first camera was discovered. Richard in the office at midnight on a Sunday, which she remembered because she'd had to clean around him, and he'd been irritated about it. She'd seen him carrying a small ladder from the supply closet, claimed he was checking the air conditioning vents for a draft complaint. The security footage from that night had been automatically deleted after 30 days, long before anyone knew to look for it. When confronted with this, Richard didn't deny it, didn't make excuses, just smiled this small, satisfied smile, and asked for his lawyer. They found videos on his home computer, hundreds of hours organized by date and person, each file meticulously labeled. He'd been selling the footage online, running a sick little business out of our trauma. He got 8 years, lost his engineering license, his pension, everything. But even now, when I use any bathroom that isn't in my own home, I look up at the ceiling first, checking for little black circles in things that shouldn't have them, knowing that somewhere out there, strangers might still be watching videos of the most private moments of my life. Six months into my job as a compliance officer at Riverside Private Hospital, everything changed on what started as a routine Monday morning. Fresh from my master's program and eager to prove myself, I'd been assigned to review billing discrepancies that everyone assumed were simple clerical errors. The hospital treated celebrities and wealthy families from across the state, and my supervisor had made it clear that accuracy was paramount for maintaining our reputation. My cramped office on the 3rd floor had become my second home, surrounded by stacks of files and dual monitors displaying endless spreadsheets. Most people my age were out partying on weekends while I was cross-referencing insurance claims with treatment records, determined to make a good impression at my first real job. That morning, coffee in hand, I noticed something strange in the cardiac unit's billing from the previous quarter. A patient named George Whitman had supposedly undergone 3 separate angioplasties in a single week, each billed at $47,000. When I pulled his treatment logs from our medical database, only one procedure appeared, performed by Dr. Chen on a Wednesday afternoon. I checked another file, then another, and my pulse quickened as a pattern emerged. Dozens of patients showed multiple expensive procedures in billing that didn't exist in the actual medical records. Some patients had been discharged days before their supposed surgeries. Others had never even been admitted to the units where these procedures allegedly took place. By noon, I documented over 200 fraudulent claims totaling nearly $8 million. The fake entries followed a sophisticated pattern, always staying just below the threshold that would trigger an automatic insurance review. Someone had created phantom patient IDs that existed only in the billing system, complete with fake social security numbers and addresses that led to vacant lots or abandoned buildings. Each fraudulent claim was approved by the same sequence of administrators, their digital signatures appearing on documents for procedures that never happened. The money trail disappeared into a maze of department budgets and external vendor payments that would take weeks to fully untangle. I printed everything, my heart racing as page after page confirmed what I was seeing wasn't a mistake, but deliberate, systematic fraud. I spent the rest of that afternoon triple-checking my findings, creating backup files on my personal laptop and a flash drive I kept in my purse. The scope of this was beyond anything I'd imagined when I took this job. Whoever orchestrated this understood our system's blind spots perfectly, exploiting the gap between medical records and billing that existed because the two databases didn't automatically sync. They knew exactly how long they had before monthly reconciliation reports were generated, and they'd been careful to spread the fraud across different departments to avoid detection. My supervisor, Michael Thornton, Was out of town until tomorrow, so I decided to compile everything into a comprehensive report that would be impossible to ignore or dismiss. Around 7 that evening, alone in the office with only the emergency lighting in the hallways, I heard footsteps approaching my door. Dr. Harrison, our chief medical officer, appeared in my doorway wearing his golf clothes instead of his usual suit. He rarely stayed past 4, and I'd never seen him on this floor before. He glanced at the papers spread across my desk, then at my computer screen still displaying billing records, and asked what was keeping me so late. His voice was casual, but his eyes moved quickly across my workspace, taking in every detail. I told him I was working on routine audits, trying to keep my voice steady while discreetly closing my laptop. He nodded slowly, mentioned something about dedication being admirable in young employees, then suggested I should head home and get some rest. After he left, I waited 10 minutes before gathering everything and leaving through the back stairwell. The next morning, Michael Thornton was already in his office when I arrived at 8, even though his assistant had said he wouldn't be back until afternoon. He called me in immediately, closing the door with a deliberate click that made my stomach tighten. His usually friendly demeanor was replaced by something I couldn't quite read as he gestured for me to sit in the chair facing his desk. The blinds were drawn, unusual for him, casting the room in a dim yellow glow from his desk lamp. He asked me about my audit findings, specifically mentioning the cardiac unit, which I hadn't told anyone about yet. When I started to explain what I'd discovered, he held up his hand and pulled out a thick folder from his drawer. Inside was my employment contract, with the non-disclosure agreement highlighted in yellow, along with printed screenshots of my computer activity from yesterday. Michael leaned back in his chair and explained, in a tone like he was discussing the weather, that Riverside had certain financial arrangements that kept the hospital running and able to provide excellent care. These arrangements, he continued, were approved at the highest levels, including by our biggest donor, James Fitzgerald, who also happened to chair the board of directors. The fraudulent billing I'd discovered wasn't fraud at all, he insisted, but a complex financial structure designed to offset operational costs that insurance companies refuse to cover. He showed me a document with my digital signature, supposedly authorizing these transactions, though I'd never seen it before. The timestamp showed it was created yesterday evening, after I'd left the office. He said I had 2 choices: continue my work focusing on other departments and receive a substantial raise, or persist with this investigation and face legal action for violating my NDA and potentially embezzling funds myself, given my signature on these documents. I sat there, feeling the walls of that office press closer as he outlined how my career would end before it started if I didn't cooperate. He mentioned that young professionals sometimes misunderstood complex healthcare financing, that my student loans of $70,000 must be a burden, and that Riverside valued employees who showed discretion. The raise he offered was more than double my current salary, enough to pay off my loans in 2 years instead of 10. All I had to do was delete my files, forget what I'd seen, and focus on other areas of compliance. He gave me until the end of the day to decide, though we both knew there was only one answer he'd accept. As I stood to leave, he added that Fitzgerald's influence extended far beyond Riverside, that every hospital in the state relied on his donations, and that making an enemy of him would ensure I'd never work in healthcare again. I spent the rest of the day in a haze, mechanically going through motions while my mind raced through options that all seemed to lead nowhere good. During lunch, I walked to my car and retrieved the flash drive from my purse, planning to mail it to a journalist I'd found who specialized in healthcare fraud. But when I reached the post office, a security guard from Riverside was standing by the entrance, casually scrolling through his phone. He looked up, made eye contact, and nodded at me with a slight smile. I turned around and went back to the office, the flash drive burning like a weight in my pocket. By 4 o'clock, I hadn't given Michael an answer, so I quietly packed my personal items into a box, left my company laptop on my desk, and walked out without saying goodbye to anyone. The security guard at the main entrance made a phone call as I passed, and I knew they were tracking every move I made. That evening, I stayed with my friend Ashley, too paranoid to go back to my apartment alone. I'd told her I was having issues at work but couldn't elaborate, and she didn't push for details. Around midnight, she woke me up to show me an email from Riverside's HR department that had been sent to all staff. It announced my immediate resignation for personal reasons and thanked me for my contributions during my brief tenure. My company email had already been deactivated, and when I checked my bank account, my final paycheck had been deposited with an additional month's severance I hadn't agreed to. Ashley asked if I wanted to talk about it, but I just stared at the screen, realizing they'd already written me out of the story. The next morning, she drove me to my apartment to get some clothes and important documents. The door to my apartment was closed but unlocked, something I would never do. Inside, nothing looked obviously disturbed at first glance, but small things were wrong in ways that made my skin prickle. My laptop was gone from the kitchen table where I'd left it, though the power cord remained plugged into the wall. The flash drive I'd hidden inside an old shoebox in my closet had vanished, along with all the printed documents I'd stuffed under my mattress. Even my personal files, tax returns, and bank statements had been carefully removed from my filing cabinet. But they'd left other things untouched: my jewelry box, my television, making it clear this wasn't a regular burglary. On my refrigerator, held by the same magnet I used for grocery lists, was a printed copy of my NDA with certain sections circled in red ink. Ashley grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the door, whispering that we needed to leave immediately. We filed a police report that afternoon, though the officers seemed oddly uninterested when I mentioned my employer's name. They took notes, said they'd investigate, but their expression suggested this would go nowhere. Over the next week, strange things kept happening. My credit card was flagged for suspicious activity I hadn't made. My phone would ring with silence on the other end, and 2 different apartment applications were rejected without explanation. When I finally reached out to that journalist about the story, she told me her editor had killed the investigation after a call from Fitzgerald's lawyers threatening a defamation suit. I realized then that fighting this would mean losing everything, that they'd already won by making the cost of truth too high to pay. So I did what they wanted. I stayed quiet, moved to a different state, and started over in a field that had nothing to do with healthcare. Sometimes I check the news to see if Riverside ever gets exposed, but 3 years later, they're still operating, still billing insurance companies for procedures that never happen, and probably destroying anyone else who gets too close to the truth. It happened during a time when I thought my life had finally stabilized. I had been working at a medium-sized manufacturing company in Pennsylvania for a few years, handling internal audits and supplier payments. Nothing glamorous, but steady, predictable work, the kind that lets you sleep at night knowing every number matches. My supervisor, Mr. Caldwell, liked to joke that I was married to spreadsheets. I took pride in being meticulous, maybe too much for my own good. That habit is what started all of this. One afternoon, while cross-checking vendor invoices for a quarterly report, I noticed a small repetition in our payment log. The same invoice number appeared twice, 2 weeks apart, for the same amount. I figured it was a copy error and dug deeper. That is when I found 3 more, same structure, same formatting, but tied to supplier names I did not recognize. When I tried to look up their registration details, the company database said the vendors did not exist. No address, no tax record, nothing. Just blank entries sitting in our system like ghosts. I mentioned it quietly to Mr. Caldwell, not accusing, just trying to understand. He gave a small laugh, one of those dry ones that sound more like a dismissal than amusement. "Glitch in the software," he said, waving his coffee mug as if that settled it. "The system pulls old test data sometimes. Just clear the duplicates." I wanted to believe him, but his tone carried something offhand, too casual for someone whose department might be mishandling thousands of dollars. Still, I nodded and went back to my desk. The next morning, my access to the shared accounting drive was gone. I could not open the supplier logs, could not even reach the folders I worked on every day. I thought it was an IT error and emailed the support desk. By the time they got back to me, the logs had been updated. Someone had altered the audit trail to show that I was the one who created the duplicate invoices. My name, my ID, even my approval signature were attached to every single fake supplier entry. I remember sitting there staring at the screen trying to understand how a file I never touched could bear my credentials so perfectly. I went straight to Caldwell's office, but he was not there. His desk was cleared out except for a single coffee ring on the corner. No one seemed to know where he went, or maybe they were told not to talk. By noon, Human Resources called me in for a quick chat. The manager, Mrs. Halloran, said they had received an internal report of fraudulent entries in the accounts payable system, entries connected to my login. I tried to explain what I had discovered, how I had flagged the duplicates and was told it was a glitch, but her expression tightened. She said she could not discuss the details while there was an ongoing investigation. That afternoon, I tried to access my personal files on the local drive, but half of them were missing. Someone had replaced my working folder with an older version that made me look careless, like I had been hiding data. I checked the log timestamps and noticed they matched the same window when my account had been disabled the day before. I called IT again, and this time the technician hesitated before speaking. He said quietly, "Your name was flagged for manual monitoring. I should not even be talking to you." That was when I realized this was not a misunderstanding. It was an orchestrated setup. I spent the next evening combing through every backup I had kept on my flash drive at home, every invoice, every supplier record, but even my offline copies were tampered with. The metadata showed edits I never made, dated for times when I was not even at the office. It felt impossible, like someone had remote access to everything I touched. I started documenting my findings, printing out each version, hoping to piece together a timeline that could clear my name. But with each step forward, another piece of evidence surfaced against me, stronger than before. 2 days later, I got a call from a detective with the local police department. He said they had received a formal complaint from my company, accusing me of embezzlement and data manipulation. When I told him I was about to report the same crime but from the other side, there was a pause. He asked me to come in for questioning. That night, I sat at my kitchen table staring at the stack of printouts. My name, my initials, my approval stamps, all perfectly forged. It was like watching my own identity rewritten by invisible hands. At the police station, the detective showed me printed emails supposedly sent from my company account. Each one approved payments to those phantom suppliers. The tone of the messages even sounded like me. Same phrasing, same punctuation habits. I pointed out that the timestamps did not match my work hours and that the email headers could be forged, but he only nodded, saying they would verify everything. I could tell by his expression that he thought I was guilty before I even sat down. The weight of something I did not do was already closing in around me. When I left the station, my phone buzzed non-stop with messages from coworkers. Some offered sympathy, others avoided saying anything direct. Then I got one that made me stop in the middle of the sidewalk. It was from an unknown number. You should have left it alone. No name, no context. Just that line. I deleted it immediately, but I could not shake the thought that whoever had sent it was close. Someone inside the same building. Maybe someone I saw every day. I began to realize this was not just about money. It was about control. About making someone disappear without physically touching them. In the days that followed, my bank accounts were frozen. The company suspended me pending investigation, and my access badge stopped working. Friends from the office stopped answering calls. The more I tried to defend myself, the deeper the hole seemed to get. Even the detective said it looked like I was trying to rewrite the narrative. The irony almost made me laugh. Everything I did to prove my innocence became more evidence of guilt. I barely slept, waiting for the knock on my door that could come at any moment. Eventually, I hired an independent forensic analyst, someone outside the company. It took months, but he found traces of a remote access tool installed through an internal maintenance update. the same patch that my department had been told to approve the week before everything began. When the report went public, the company quietly dropped the charges. No apology, no admission, nothing. I moved states shortly after. To this day, I keep every login on a separate device and never stay logged in anywhere longer than I need to. Because I know now, once someone decides to rewrite your history, they can make it look like you were never innocent to begin with. The night shifts at the old corporate building were supposed to be easy money. The place had been empty for years, waiting for a renovation project that never seemed to start. My job was simple: walk the halls every hour, make sure no one broke in, and keep an eye on the cameras. The company that hired me had a reputation for stretching their budget, which explained why the only working lights flickered like they were gasping for life. Still, it beat standing outside in the cold guarding construction sites, and I could bring my own coffee and music. The building was massive, 5 floors of cubicles, boardrooms, and forgotten offices. The kind of place where you could still smell old printer ink and stale coffee in the walls. Every sound carried in the emptiness, the hum of the vents, the buzz of the lights, even the echo of my own boots on the tile. The first few nights were uneventful. I'd make my rounds, log the times, check the cameras, and sometimes sit by the main desk scrolling through my phone. But then small things started happening that made me feel like the building wasn't completely asleep. It began with the motion sensors. The system would ping randomly, showing movement in areas I had already locked. Most nights it happened on the 3rd floor, which didn't bother me too much at first. I figured it was rats, maybe even drafts setting off the sensors. But after a week, I noticed something strange in the logs. Every single alert came from the same spot: a corridor near the old executive offices where the doors had been sealed off years ago. The maintenance guy once told me that floor had been shut down after an accident, though he wouldn't say what kind. By the end of that week, the static on my radio began acting up too. At first it was just faint white noise, but soon it sounded like someone whispering through it. I'd switch channels thinking it was interference, but it always came back. The weirdest part was that sometimes, only for a second, I'd swear I heard my name. Eddie. Clear as day, right before the static cut out completely. I tried to laugh it off, but it's hard to stay calm when you hear your own name echo through an empty building. The following night, I made a note to check the cameras every time the motion alert came through. Around 2 in the morning, the monitor flickered, and one of the feeds blinked to black before coming back online. The timestamp matched the sensor trip: 3rd floor, east corridor. The feed only showed the sealed door at the end of the hallway, but something about the frame looked different. There was a faint shimmer on the glass panel, like the reflection of someone moving just out of view. When I went up there to check, the air felt heavy, and the light above the door buzzed like a wasp caught inside it. The tape around the frame was intact, though. Nothing looked disturbed. I started leaving my patrol for last on that floor. I told myself it was to save time, but the truth is I wanted to get it over with. The elevator made it worse. Every time I reached for the button, I'd see the faint smear of fingerprints on the inside mirror, like someone had been pressing their hand there. I was the only one with access after dark. Still, the prints would reappear by the next night. Once, I wiped them clean and watched through the camera feed later. Around 3:20, the elevator doors opened on their own and stayed that way for 10 seconds before closing again. By the 4th week, I could barely concentrate. My coffee went untouched most nights, and I kept the radio volume low just so I wouldn't have to hear the static creeping back in. Then one night, right before my shift ended, the elevator lights blinked. I heard the chime echo through the empty lobby. The display showed it stopping on the 3rd floor. I froze in place, watching as the numbers lingered there longer than usual. No one came down. After a minute, it started moving again, but instead of going to the lobby, it went up to the 5th floor. I took the stairs that night. The building's maintenance logs were stored in the small office behind reception. Out of curiosity, I checked the folder marked Incidents. Most of it was dull. Water leaks, power issues. But one report stood out. It was dated almost 15 years ago and mentioned a fire on the 3rd floor. A technician had died after getting trapped in the ventilation shaft. They said the area was sealed after that for safety reasons. The report ended with a note saying the elevator had malfunctioned during the evacuation. When I read that, I felt a chill crawl through me. Every time that elevator stopped on the 3rd floor, it was at the same time the fire had broken out. The next evening, I told myself I would ignore it. I turned off the elevator camera feed, left the volume on my radio low, and tried to focus on my route. But around the same time as always, the elevator chime rang again. I stared at the panel on the security desk. It had stopped on the 3rd floor. I hesitated, then picked up my flashlight and took the stairs. The moment I reached the 2nd floor landing, I heard the faint hum of machinery above me, like the air system had come alive for the first time in years. My flashlight beam shook as I reached the 3rd floor door. The tape across it was torn clean through. I opened it just far enough to see inside. The hallway was darker than the rest of the building, and a layer of fine dust covered the floor, except for a single trail of footprints leading toward the end of the corridor. They stopped right in front of the sealed office door, the one that showed up on the motion sensors. My chest tightened when the radio on my shoulder hissed again. This time, the voice came through more clearly. It said my name again, once, then twice, before fading out. The air smelled faintly like burned plastic. When I stepped back, the lights above me flickered so violently that the corridor strobed white and black. For a split second, I saw someone standing by the office door. A figure, shoulders slumped, wearing what looked like a maintenance uniform. I blinked and the hallway was empty again. I ran, leaving the door wide open behind me, my boots echoing through the stairwell. When I reached the lobby, the elevator doors slid open by themselves. The display said 3, then it went blank. I quit the next morning. The supervisor did not seem surprised. He just nodded and said, "That floor still giving you trouble?" As if he already knew. A few weeks later, I drove past the building and saw workers tearing down the front entrance. The elevator cables were hanging loose like veins through the exposed floors. I have worked other jobs since then, but no matter where I go, I still hear that faint static every now and then, like someone whispering through a dead frequency, still trying to say my name. The building where I worked had this strange quiet after 6 in the evening. Most of the call center agents rushed out as soon as their shift ended, but I liked finishing my reports before heading home. My cubicle was in the corner, next to a window that faced a dark parking lot filled with flickering lights. That evening, the sky looked heavy, the kind of gray that makes everything inside feel smaller. I remember the faint hum of the air conditioner and the soft static in my headset. Just background noise that made me feel less alone. I had been handling calls for a healthcare hotline, mostly people asking about coverage or waiting times. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. My supervisor, Trevor, had left early for a dentist appointment, and the team leader on duty didn't seem to notice I stayed behind. Around 6:40, I saw a few coworkers passing by my row, laughing about something, one of them mentioning a drill over the sound of their chatter. I assumed it was one of those late safety checks they sometimes ran. They were gone within minutes. The floor grew still, and I sank into my chair, typing notes from the last call. My headset stayed on because I liked listening to the recorded prompts. They drowned out the echo of my own typing. I remember feeling oddly calm, almost cocooned by routine. When the power flickered once, I thought nothing of it. It happened sometimes when the maintenance crew tested circuits in the building. The lights dimmed, buzzed, then stabilized again. Maybe 10 minutes later, I noticed a faint smell, like burnt plastic. It was subtle at first, almost chemical, like the scent from overheated wires behind a computer. I looked around and saw nothing unusual. The red standby light on the printer glowed steadily. My monitor stayed bright, and the hallway outside my cubicle was still. I kept working, assuming it was just someone heating leftovers in the break room microwave again. The smell got stronger. I leaned back and took off my headset, realizing the office was far too silent. Usually, the faint clatter of keyboards or the distant hum of vending machines filled the space, but now there was nothing. Just that low, uneven buzz from the ceiling lights. I stood up, peering over the cubicle walls toward the main corridor. The emergency exit sign glowed faintly red, and through the frosted glass partition I thought I saw movement, like shadows shifting quickly past the door. Curiosity pushed me closer to the hallway. That was when I noticed a thin trail of smoke creeping along the ceiling. My first thought was that something shorted out in the server room. I hurried to the stairwell door, but it wouldn't budge. The security system must have locked it automatically, which sometimes happened after hours. I tried my keycard. Nothing. A mechanical beep and a solid click that did not release. By now the haze was spreading faster. It stung my eyes and left a bitter taste in my mouth. I ran to the other end of the floor where another exit door was located. Same problem. Locked. My phone was on the desk, and for a second I hesitated to go back. The smoke was thicker near my cubicle. I used my sleeve to cover my face, stumbling back through the corridor. My head was spinning, and I could hear faint thuds somewhere below, maybe from people or heavy equipment. When I reached my desk again, I grabbed my phone and tried calling building security, but no one answered. The signal kept cutting in and out. I sent a text to a coworker, just saying there was smoke and I was still inside. I didn't realize until later that by then, the entire floor below had already been engulfed in flames. The lights flickered again, then went out completely, leaving only the dim emergency glow from the exit signs and the orange shimmer crawling under the door at the far end. I remember grabbing my jacket and waving it near the floor, hoping to push the smoke away just enough to breathe. The sound of the fire alarms finally reached me, muffled through the walls mixed with distant voices. I yelled for help, but my own voice barely carried. The air was so dense it felt like trying to speak underwater. Every step toward the far window grew heavier, the carpet warm under my shoes, sticky from melted plastic. Through the glass, I could see flashes of red, emergency lights reflecting against the neighboring building. I pressed my face close to the cool metal of the window frame, trying to catch a breath. The heat kept building behind me. Then I heard something slam, the main door being forced open from the other side. I dropped to the floor, coughing, as two figures in heavy suits burst through the haze. They shouted something I couldn't make out. Then one of them grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the stairwell. The next few minutes were a blur of motion, alarms, and roaring noise. The firefighters carried me out through the service stairs, where the concrete walls were streaked black. When the cold air hit my face outside, I barely managed to keep my eyes open. Someone wrapped a blanket around me and told me I had been lucky. The heat sensors had tripped too late. I spent the night at the hospital with mild burns and smoke inhalation. They said I had passed out right before they reached me. Weeks later, I learned that the safety officer responsible for the evacuation had left early that night. He never checked my floor. The company did not say much publicly, only that procedures had been reviewed. I still work in offices sometimes, but I never stay after hours anymore. Every faint smell of burned dust from a heater or a computer cable still brings back that same quiet moment, the one right before I realized I was completely alone in a burning building.